In the aftermath of World War II, the United States also wanted to rebuild Germany, and really in large parts, most of Western Europe, especially the areas in which British, American, and the French occupied. And part of it was done as an effort to rebuild Europe as a humanitarian effort. Another part was that the United States feared that Europe might be a drain economically from that standpoint. The biggest aspect, though, the United States wanted to strengthen pro Western governments so as to ensure that they don't fall under Soviet or otherwise communist control. All of those things the United States feared. So in 1947, Secretary of State George Marshall enacted the Marshall Plan, which was a policy to provide economic assistance to European nations, including the Soviet Union, by the way, to obtain these objectives. Okay, they wanted to rebuild Europe, basically. Of course, the Soviet Union and its puppets largely rejected this. They kind of saw what was intended. Oh, you want to contain us? We reject you. That sort of a thing. Okay. Um, Most of Western Europe accepted the Marshall Plan. Czechoslovakia, which is now the Czech Republic, and Slovakia, before they used to be two different countries merged into one, um, saw a communist coup government take over in 1948, and Czechoslovakia would become largely a Soviet puppet. So they were excluded. However, um, that spring in 1948, the United States went ahead and administered the Marshall Plan, and it aided building Europe with roughly $12 billion in 1948 dollars. That's pretty stout. But it began an economic revival in Europe that would increase industrial production by about 64% or so, nearly two thirds. And communist influence in those Western European countries would subside. So, those pockets of communism that the United States feared and the communists who were trying to gain influence, they lost a lot of their influence as a result of the Marshall Plan. Back home, the United States recognized, hey, we need to implement our selective service. So when you're 18, you register at the post office or whatnot for selective service. So as if there was a war, you could theoretically be drafted. Um, Further, the Atomic Energy Commission in 1946 was enacted that would give nuclear authority over all American nuclear armaments, atomic bombs, anything else of the sort. Um, it would reshape various different things as far as nuclear policy is concerned. And it would approve construction of a hydrogen bomb, which would actually be far more lethal than the atomic bombs we dropped on Japan. Then the National Security Act of 1947 reshifted and reshaped our defense. No longer did we have a War and Navy Department. We would now have a Department of Defense, which would unite all of our services under one umbrella, Department of Defense. You would have the Army, the Navy, Marines, but instead of the Army Air Corps, you would now have an establishment of a completely separate service. The Army Air Corps would soon become the United States Air Force, a separate branch of the military from the United States Army. So you would see that. They could help the president pursue international goals. Um, you would also see the CIA be developed, the Central Intelligence Agency, which would now promote American interests abroad through acts of secrecy and espionage or anything else of the sort. Gather intelligence. What are the Soviets doing in this country over here? Um, Basically, through open and covert methods, the CIA would protect American interests abroad. So, those were several things that would take place around that time. It also became obvious because the Soviets had gained such expansive influence in Eastern Europe that as part of our containment effort, we would need to thwart them, unite our allies, and then form various different agreements to where if the United States should go into war, we wouldn't be alone. So, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization was formed largely because of the Soviet influence in Germany itself. The western portion of Germany was under American, British, and French influence. Eastern Germany, Soviet influence. To keep that in play, NATO would be formed rather, largely as a result of the Berlin airlift. So, Berlin itself was in the eastern half of Germany, which was controlled by the Soviets, but having been the capital of Germany itself, Berlin was split up. The eastern part of Berlin was under the Soviets, and the western part was split between British, French, and American. Joseph Stalin had decided to block and completely surround Berlin and not allow entry into any port into Berlin. So your Americans, French, and British could not get to Berlin by road. They were blocked by the Soviets. So the United States enacted the Berlin airlift. Well, they're going to block us over the roads. They're not going to shoot us out of the sky. So we're going to send airplanes and we're going to drop supplies and other things that are necessary for West Berlin survival and maintain facilitation from that point there on. So Joseph Stalin could not prevent 2.5 million tons of supplies over the course of 10 months to the people in West Berlin. That kept 2 million people alive. We would fly stuff over West Berlin, keep them supplied. Stalin couldn't do anything about it. And then eventually, in the spring of 1949, Joseph Stalin ended the blockade, and Germany would be officially split into two different countries. East Germany would become the Democratic East German Republic, which would really be Soviet controlled. And the Federal Republic, the pro-democratic, pro-West Germany, would now be the other country. So you would have two Germanys, West Germany and East Germany. West Germany, friendly to the US, East Germany, communist. That would stand for roughly 40 years. You would have those two countries, East Germany, West Germany. As a kid, I grew up with two Germanys until 1989, when one of them collapsed and they merged into one beautiful Germany. Guess who wins? Yay. Hold that thought. Otherwise, though, later on that spring, of course, I mentioned that NATO had been formed, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, as a result of the Soviet Union expanding its powers and expanding its influence. The West wanted to do the same thing. So the United States, Germany, or I'm sorry, West Germany rather, United Kingdom, France, and then of course a number of other Western European countries decided to form an alliance. Should one of us be attacked, we're going to consider that as all of us being attacked, and we're going to defend ourselves accordingly. So, with that in mind, the Soviet Union decided to do the same thing in Eastern Europe. A lot of these Eastern Bloc countries, Czechoslovakia, Poland, Hungary, your Baltic states, they would become the Warsaw Pact. And in reality, the Soviet Union, which had been invaded by German armies for two different wars, they wanted not only allies, they also wanted Eastern Europe to serve as a buffer. Should there be another major world war, perhaps an invasion of the Soviet Union, you would have Baltic states and Eastern European countries that would be invaded first before you get to the Soviet mainland. That would be kind of a buffer. So you have the Warsaw Pact You have NATO, you have competing ideology, you have the Berlin airlift, which had been lifted thanks to American air power, and you have all of that going on. So now we've got to rethink how we're going to do things with the Cold War.